Mr. Carter, if you continue disrupting my courtroom, I will hold you in contempt.
Judge Veronica Langford's voice thundered through the room. But Damian Carter, he didn't flinch.
Your Honor, you're proving exactly what I've been saying. This trial is rigged.
Then, the courtroom doors burst open. What happens when a corrupt judge finally faces justice? Stay till the end to find out. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that expose the truth. Houston, Texas. The air outside the courthouse was thick with the usual southern humidity, clinging to skin and clothes like an unshakable weight. But inside Courtroom 7, the heaviness wasn't from the weather. It was something else, something colder. A quiet, oppressive force that had settled into the very bones of the building. This was Judge Veronica Langford's courtroom, and for 25 years she had ruled over it with an iron grip. She wasn't just a judge, she was the law, at least in this part of Houston. She sat high on the bench, her silver hair coiled into a tight bun, her expression unreadable behind the thin wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. To the outside world, she was a respected figure, a seasoned judge with decades of experience. But behind the polished veneer was something much darker. Langford didn't serve justice. She served herself. She had built a career on handing down harsh sentences to black men, funneling them into the prison system like cattle. And she didn't do it for free. Private prison companies paid handsomely for every long sentence she handed out. Every extra year behind bars meant more profit for them, and in turn, more cash quietly lining her pockets. Her corruption ran deep. It wasn't just about money, it was about power. She controlled this courtroom so completely that no one dared to challenge her. Lawyers who tried had seen their careers mysteriously crumble. Prosecutors who didn't follow her lead were replaced. Defendants never stood a chance. And today, it was Kevin Wallace's turn. Kevin Wallace sat stiffly at the defense table, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, and in this courtroom, that was enough. The evidence against him. A joke. A grainy surveillance video of a robbery so blurry you could barely make out the shape of the suspect. No fingerprints, no DNA, no physical evidence tying him to the crime. A single witness, an elderly store clerk who had hesitated for too long before identifying him. Yet here he was, charged, on trial, facing years, maybe decades, behind bars. Because the second his name hit Langford's desk, his fate had already been decided, and he knew it. Kevin's shoulders were hunched, his suit a little too big, the sleeves slightly frayed at the cuffs, borrowed, maybe from a friend or a cousin. He looked like a man who had already been condemned, not because of guilt, but because the system was never designed to see him as anything else. Then, the courtroom doors swung open and Damian Carter stepped inside. The atmosphere shifted, subtle but noticeable. Damian walked with purpose, his polished black shoes tapping against the floor in a steady, deliberate rhythm. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a crisp navy suit that fit like it had been made just for him. He carried himself like a man who had walked into too many courtrooms just like this one, and hated every single one of them. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the players of this rigged game. The smirking prosecutor at his table, too young, too eager, thinking he had already won. The jury, carefully selected, mostly white, their expressions unreadable. The reporters in the gallery, pens poised, waiting for another case they thought they already knew the outcome of. And then there was Judge Veronica Langford. Their eyes met. A silent battle line was drawn right there. Langford had heard of him before. He wasn't just another defense attorney, he was trouble, the kind who didn't just fight cases, he fought the system itself. Her lips pressed into a thin, unimpressed line. Damian, he just smirked. Damien took his seat beside Kevin, adjusting his cuffs, his movements unhurried, controlled. He leaned in, speaking low enough that only his client could hear. "You holding up, man?" Kevin swallowed hard, nodded. "Barely." Damien nodded back, as if to say, "I got you." Then he leaned back in his chair, turning his gaze toward Langford as she rapped her gavel against the bench. "This court is now in session." Her voice was even, but there was something behind it, something cold, calculating. She had already decided how this was going to go. But what she didn't know, what no one in this room knew yet, was that Damien Carter wasn't here to play along. He was here to burn it all down. The prosecution started its case. The young, eager prosecutor Dylan Reeves stepped forward, slicking back his already perfectly in place hair. He was too green to understand what was really happening here, but he didn't have to be good. Not in Langford's courtroom. She would carry him through it, smooth over his stumbles, twist the rules to his favor, because that's how this game worked, and Damien knew it. As Reeves launched into his opening statement, Damien barely listened. He already knew the script by heart. He had seen it too many times. A generic, impassioned speech about justice. A dramatic retelling of the robbery, painting Kevin as the villain. A quick brush over of the evidence, hoping no one would notice how weak it actually was. And then, right on cue, Langford nodded approvingly, her gaze flicking toward the jury, silently guiding them. Damien exhaled slowly. This courtroom was a machine built to crush men like Kevin Wallace. But today, something was different. Damien Carter had just thrown a wrench into its gears. He smoothed his tie, stood up, and strode toward the jury box, every movement measured, controlled, deliberate. His voice was steady, but there was fire underneath it. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let's talk about facts." A pause. No fingerprints, no DNA, no hard evidence. Just a grainy video and a single hesitant witness. And yet, my client is sitting here today, fighting for his freedom. He let the words sink in. If that doesn't make you uneasy, it should. Langford tilted her head slightly, watching him, but Damien didn't stop. Because this is bigger than just Kevin Wallace. This is about how easily a man can be accused, how quickly the system will move to crush him, and how that system, more often than not, has one thing in common. His gaze swept the courtroom before landing back on the jury. The color of his skin. The room shifted, uncomfortable, silent. Damien's eyes flicked to Langford just in time to catch the slightest narrowing of her gaze. He smiled. She felt it. The shift. The challenge. The fact that, for the first time in 25 years, someone had walked into her courtroom unafraid of her. Today was different. Today, she wasn't the one in control anymore. And for the first time, the war for justice had truly begun. The second Damien Carter stepped into Judge Veronica Langford's courtroom, he could feel it. The air was thick with something unspoken but undeniable, that quiet, heavy weight of a place where justice wasn't just blind but deliberately ignorant. This courtroom wasn't about truth. It wasn't about fairness. It was about power. And right now, all of that power sat perched on the judge's bench, watching the proceedings unfold exactly the way she wanted them to. Prosecutor Dylan Reeves stood at his table, his suit crisp, his posture perfect, but his confidence manufactured. He was young, too young to have earned his position on merit alone. Damien had seen his type before. A lawyer who thought he was winning because of his skill, when in reality his victories were handed to him. A man who wasn't good, just obedient. And Reeves? He was nothing if not obedient to Langford. As the trial began, Reeves strode toward the jury, flashing them a polished politician's smile. He spoke with just enough passion to sound convincing, but not enough to sound like he believed it himself. "Ladies and gentlemen, the case before you is simple." Of course it was. That was the point. Langford didn't like complicated cases. Complicated cases meant questions. Complicated cases meant deliberation. Complicated cases meant uncertainty, and she couldn't afford uncertainty. So this case was kept clean, kept simple, kept rigged from the start. Reeves continued, pacing slightly in front of the jury. We have a crime. A robbery caught on surveillance footage. A suspect. He gestured toward Kevin, barely sparing him a glance. An eyewitness who identified him. He smiled like he had just unraveled the greatest mystery of our time. Damien leaned back in his chair, resisting the urge to laugh. This wasn't an argument. This was a script. And everyone in this room, from the jury to the spectators in the gallery, already knew how this play was supposed to end. But today, Damien wasn't going to let it end the way they expected. It happened just as Reeves finished his statement, right before Langford could motion for the first witness. The clerk of the court stepped forward, setting a thick folder onto the prosecution's table. Damien's stomach tightened the second he saw it. He turned slightly to Kevin. "Did they mention any new evidence to you?" he whispered. Kevin's eyes flickered with confusion. "No," Damien's jaw clenched. This was wrong. Evidence had to be shared before the trial began. It was law, black and white, no gray area. The defense had a right to review everything. But Reeves, he was already flipping through the folder like this was just another step in their perfectly planned performance. And Langford, she just watched. She knew. And she was waiting to see if Damien would fall in line like everyone else before him. Instead, he stood up. "Your Honor, this is a direct violation of criminal procedure." The room froze. It was so quiet Damien could hear the scratch of a reporter's pen against paper. Langford's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something almost amused. She tapped her gavel once. Denied. Just like that. No explanation, no justification, just one word, absolute and final. Damien took a breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Your Honor, with all due respect, that folder contains evidence we have not been given access to." "That is clear," Langford sighed, not in frustration but in boredom. "Mr. Carter, if you're planning to grandstand, I suggest you take it elsewhere." Grandstand. Damien almost laughed. He looked at Reeves, who was doing his best to suppress a smirk, flipping through the documents like a kid with a cheat sheet before an exam. Damien gritted his teeth. He knew this would happen. He had seen it before. But knowing it was coming didn't make it any less infuriating. Langford tapped her gavel again. "Motion denied. Mr. Reeves, continue." Damien sat down, forcing himself to breathe through the frustration. This wasn't just about evidence. This was about the system protecting itself. This courtroom wasn't built for justice. It was built for control. And Langford, she was the architect of it all. She didn't just enforce the rules. She bent them, broke them, twisted them, whatever it took to get the result she wanted. And right now she wanted Kevin Wallace convicted. Langford looked at Damien again just for a moment, and he understood. This was a warning. Don't fight me. Don't challenge me. Don't think you can win, because no one wins against Langford, because no one dares to challenge her. But today, objection. He said it before Reeves could even get another word out. Langford's eyebrow lifted slightly, but she didn't look surprised. Of course she didn't. She had expected him to push back. What she hadn't expected, what no one in this courtroom expected, was that he wasn't planning to stop. Because Damien Carter didn't come here to lose, and he damn sure didn't come here to play by Langford's rules. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was war. The tension in courtroom 7 was thick, pressing against every person in the room like the humidity outside. But inside, it wasn't the weather making people sweat. It was the slow unraveling of a trial everyone thought was already decided. Kevin Wallace sat at the defense table, shoulders stiff, fingers interlocked so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Across from him, Dylan Reeves, the young, eager prosecutor, was flipping through his notes a little too fast, his once-practiced confidence slipping with every second. And at the center of it all, standing just a little too still, was Harold Whitmore, the prosecution's key witness. Whitmore was an older man, somewhere in his 60s, with thinning white hair and a pair of glasses that kept sliding down his nose. His hands, veiny, calloused from years of work, rested on the witness stand, fingers twitching slightly. He looked like a man who had been asked to lie one too many times and was starting to crack under the weight of it. Damian Carter adjusted his cuffs as he approached the stand, his footsteps steady, deliberate. This wasn't just a cross-examination. This was the moment everything was about to change. Damian stopped just a few feet from Whitmore, keeping his expression neutral, but his eyes locked onto the older man. "Mr. Whitmore, let's talk about your testimony." Whitmore shifted in his seat, not much but enough. "You claim you saw my client, Kevin Wallace, at the scene of the robbery, that's correct?" Whitmore nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yes, sir, that's correct." Damian tilted his head slightly. "You're sure?" A pause, a flicker of hesitation. I mean, yeah, I saw him." Damian let the silence stretch, then he took a step closer. "You saw him? Or you saw someone who looked like him?" Whitmore blinked. His fingers curled slightly against the stand. Well, it was dark, but—" "Let's be clear, Mr. Whitmore. What did you originally tell the police?" Whitmore's lips parted slightly, but no words came out, so Damian helped him. He flipped open a file on the defense table, holding up a printed transcript. "Let me remind you. In your first statement you said, and I quote, 'I didn't get a good look at him. It was dark. I only saw him for a second.'" Silence. The jury shifted. One of the reporter's pens scratched faster against a notepad. Whitmore's fingers twitched. I remembered more later." Damian's expression didn't change. "Did you remember more, Mr. Whitmore? Or did someone help you remember?" Whitmore swallowed. He didn't answer. And that was answer enough. Damian turned slightly toward the jury, letting them absorb what had just been said. Then he walked toward the evidence screen, reaching into his briefcase. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce an alternate surveillance angle into evidence." For the first time since this trial started, Judge Langford hesitated. Her grip on her gavel tightened slightly, and for the briefest moment, something in her eyes shifted, not just annoyance, but something deeper. Recognition. A flicker of doubt, then it was gone. "Proceed." Damian clicked the remote, and the courtroom screen flickered to life. A new angle. A different security camera. One that hadn't been presented by the prosecution. And in the grainy footage, the suspect stood next to a gas station window, partially silhouetted against the fluorescent lights. Damian let the jury take in the image before he spoke. "Now, let's compare this footage to my client, Kevin Wallace." He gestured toward Kevin, seated at the defense table. "The prosecution claims this is the same man, but let's focus on the details." He pointed to the suspect's shadow against the window frame. "We measured the height difference between the suspect and the window frame. A beat. Kevin Wallace is 6 feet tall. Another beat. The man in this footage is 5'9". A murmur rippled through the courtroom. One of the jurors shifted uncomfortably. The reporters started writing faster. And Reeves? His face was turning pale. Damian turned back to the jury, not Langford, not the prosecution. The jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are seeing here is undeniable evidence that the suspect in this video is shorter than my client." Another pause. "Let it sink in." Then he turned back to the defense table, reached into his briefcase and pulled out another document. "But that's not all." He walked back toward Whitmore, holding the document just a little too casually. "Mr. Whitmore, do you recognize this?" Whitmore's eyes flicked toward the paper. Damien held it up just high enough for the jury to see. "This is a bank statement." A few of the jurors leaned forward slightly. "A direct deposit of $8,000. Silence. Deposited into your account." More silence. "2 days after you identified Kevin Wallace." A gasp from the gallery. A reporter's pen hit the floor. Whitmore visibly paled, his mouth opening, closing, nothing coming out. Reeves flipped through his notes like the answer might magically appear in them. And Langford. She sat perfectly still, but Damien could feel the shift in the room. Everything was different now. For the first time in 25 years, the power in Langford's courtroom had shifted. Damien stepped back, letting the silence stretch. Then he spoke, his voice calm but cutting. "Mr. Whitmore, do you still stand by your testimony?" Whitmore didn't answer, because he couldn't. Because now the truth had spoken louder than he ever could. The war for justice had officially begun, and for the first time, Langford wasn't winning. The sound of Judge Veronica Langford's gavel cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot. Bang. "Mr. Carter, if you continue disrupting my courtroom, I will hold you in contempt." Her voice was sharp, clipped, and laced with fury. Not the controlled, measured tone of a woman who held complete dominance, but that of someone who felt it slipping away. Damien Carter didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't lower his gaze the way so many before him had when Langford lashed out. Instead, he tilted his head slightly as if considering her words. Then, in the same calm, deliberate voice, he responded, "Your Honor, you are proving exactly what I've been saying. This trial is rigged." Silence. Not the heavy, oppressive kind that had loomed over Courtroom 7 since the trial began. No, this silence was different. It was electric, charged, because Damien's words weren't just an accusation. They were confirmation of what everyone in the room had already felt but never dared to say out loud. In the jury box, a few jurors shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged side glances, their previous certainty cracking under the weight of doubt. In the gallery, reporters scribbled faster, their pens scratching against their notepads like they were documenting history in real time. And the spectators? Some of them leaned forward, others whispered, a ripple of murmurs rolling through the crowd. A few even smirked, as if enjoying the rare sight of Langford losing control. Because that's exactly what was happening. Langford's mask of authority was slipping. Her iron grip on the courtroom was loosening. And for the first time in 25 years, she was losing the room. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her knuckles whitening around the gavel. "Enough," she snapped. "I will not tolerate this in my courtroom." She turned toward the court officers standing near the door. "Remove Mr. Carter from these proceedings immediately." For a moment, just a split second, Damien almost thought they would, but they hesitated. And in that hesitation, Langford realized her power wasn't as absolute as it once was. Then suddenly, the courtroom doors burst open. The sound echoed through the room, louder than the gavel had ever been. Every head whipped toward the entrance, the murmurs falling into stunned silence. 2 men stepped inside, dressed in dark suits, their movements calm, controlled, but their presence unmistakable. FBI. The badges on their belts gleamed under the fluorescent lights as they strode toward the front of the courtroom. Langford went rigid. Damien. He simply stepped back, crossed his arms, and watched. The lead agent, a tall man with graying hair and a firm expression, reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. His voice rang clear and unwavering through the courtroom. "Judge Veronica Langford, you are under federal investigation for bribery, obstruction of justice, and gross violations of civil rights." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth with trembling hands. One of the jurors let out a shaky breath, his eyes flicking between Langford and the agents, as if struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing. The reporters. Their pens flew across their notepads so fast it was almost comical. Langford's face lost its color. It wasn't just shock. It wasn't rage. It was fear. The same fear she had seen on the faces of hundreds of men who had stood before her bench, knowing their fate had already been sealed before the trial even began. And now, that fear belonged to her, but she wasn't ready to accept it, not yet. "This is outrageous," she spat, her voice higher than usual, shrill with panic. She snapped her head toward the officers still standing at the door. "Arrest Damien Carter, now." But no one moved. She turned to the court bailiffs, the very people who had enforced her orders without question for years. "I said arrest him." Nothing. Not a single one of them lifted a hand. Not one met her gaze, because they knew. It was over. Langford's breathing turned shallow, her eyes darting around the room searching for an escape. Then, in one last desperate attempt, she grabbed her phone, scrolling through her contacts with shaking fingers. She pressed a number she had memorized by heart, a lifeline, a name that had always meant protection. She held the phone to her ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then voicemail. Her hands shook violently as she tried again. Another ring. Another silence. Another voicemail. She slammed the phone onto the desk. No one was coming, her protection. Gone, her power, gone, and then she heard it, the snap of handcuffs. The lead agent stepped forward, his voice cool, professional, but final. "Judge Veronica Langford, place your hands behind your back." For a fraction of a second, her body tensed as if considering resisting, but she didn't. Slowly, her shoulders sagged, her fingers curled into fists. And then, for the first time in 25 years, she obeyed someone else's command. As the metal cuffs locked around her wrists, the last remnants of her illusion of power crumbled. The FBI agent stepped back, guiding her toward the aisle. She walked past the jury, the very people she had tried to manipulate. Past the spectators, the people who had once feared her, now staring at her with disbelief, satisfaction, even amusement. Past Damien Carter, who watched her go with the quiet certainty of a man who had known this day was coming all along. And as she reached the doors, about to be led out of the courtroom that had once been her kingdom, she heard something. It started small. A whisper. A shuffle. A shift in the air. Then a quiet chuckle from the gallery, not loud, not mocking, just satisfied. And that was worse than anything, because it meant she had already been forgotten. She wasn't Judge Langford, the untouchable force of the Houston courts. She was just another corrupt official, another criminal, another fallen tyrant. And as the doors swung shut behind her, the sound of her own cuffs clinking with every step, she finally understood. For 25 years she had owned this courtroom. Now, she would never set foot in it again. The courtroom was frozen. A place that had once been filled with oppressive certainty, where everyone had known exactly how cases like this would end, was now caught in a moment of disbelief. Judge Veronica Langford was gone. The woman who had ruled this room with an iron grip for 25 years had just been let out in handcuffs, her head low, her power completely stripped away. And yet, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the walls themselves had yet to process what had just happened. Damien Carter, however, wasn't interested in the silence. He had work to finish. Slowly he turned, his gaze locking onto Dylan Reeves, the young prosecutor who had, up until 5 minutes ago, been so sure of his inevitable victory. Now, the man looked like he had just been shoved into the middle of an earthquake. His face was pale. His hands clenched so tightly around his notes that the paper was beginning to crumple. His eyes kept darting toward the judge's empty bench, as if he were waiting for Langford to storm back in and take control again. But she wasn't coming back. This time, there was no one to save him. Damien adjusted his suit cuffs and took a step forward. "The judge presiding over this case has just been arrested for corruption," he said, his voice even but commanding. I move to dismiss all charges against my client." The words landed like a thunderclap. The jury snapped out of their daze, some glancing at one another, realization dawning. The reporters. Their pens were flying. Even the spectators in the gallery, people who had sat through trials before, people who had seen how this courtroom usually worked, seemed unable to believe what they were witnessing. Dylan Reeves was trapped, and he knew it. He hesitated for just a moment, his throat moving as he swallowed hard. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had spent months preparing this case, convinced that Kevin Wallace was just another easy conviction. He had followed Langford's lead, played by her rules, and now those very rules had been shattered in front of him. And suddenly, it wasn't Kevin Wallace who was on trial anymore. It was him. Because what would it look like if he still pushed for a conviction now? With the judge gone, with the jury no longer trusting the fairness of this court, with reporters in the room waiting for his next move. Reeves's lips parted slightly like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to protest. But he had nothing left to fight with. The case had collapsed right in front of him, and everyone knew it. His shoulders dropped slightly, his grip on his notes loosening. Then, finally, "Case dismissed," he said, his voice barely above a breath. Silence. Then louder, "Kevin Wallace is free to go." The words hung in the air, almost unreal. Kevin didn't move at first. It was like his brain refused to process what he had just heard. His entire body was tense, as if he were bracing for another blow, another twist, another moment where everything would be ripped away from him again. Then the officer standing behind him stepped forward. There was a metallic click, and the handcuffs fell away. For the first time in years, Kevin Wallace's hands were his own again. He slowly lifted them, staring down at them as if they didn't belong to him. His fingers flexed. Once. Twice. Then his shoulders began to shake. Not from fear, not from anger, but from something else. Something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in so long that he had almost forgotten what it was. Relief. Real, overwhelming, earth-shattering relief. Kevin stepped out of the courthouse doors, blinking against the sudden flood of sunlight. For so long, the only sky he had seen was through prison bars, through courtroom windows, always fractured, always just out of reach. But now it stretched out wide, endless, free. He took a deep breath, inhaling air that didn't smell like fear, didn't smell like a cell, didn't smell like a courtroom built to destroy men like him. It just smelled like the world, like possibility, like freedom. A slow, almost disbelieving smile tugged at the corners of his lips, because for the first time in so long, he was finally standing outside with no walls to keep him in. Damian Carter stood in the courthouse doorway, watching Kevin step into the sunlight. He had won today. But as he looked past Kevin, past the courthouse steps, past the celebration and relief, he knew this fight wasn't over. Because Veronica Langford was just one judge. Kevin Wallace was just one man, and the system that had nearly swallowed them both whole, it was still standing, still waiting to do the same thing to someone else, someone who wouldn't have a lawyer like Damian, someone who wouldn't have a second chance. So no, this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. If you believe in justice, if you believe in fighting corruption, don't let this be the last story you hear. Hit that like button. Drop a comment below. Share this video with someone who still believes in real justice, because this fight isn't over. And together, we can make sure no one stands alone in it.